We ain't again,
Yes. Okay.
Oh my God.
Get started, huh? Right?
Thank you. Thank you so much. We needed that. Wow, that was supposed to be a joke, but I'm so glad
It,
that
it was totally a joke.
that happened. Thank you so much, production people.
Yes.
So now when I point back, yes, absolutely. And that's how we're getting this discussion started. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to WJCL. Here at Sphinx Connect, I'm LaRob K, Rafael, and I'm very grateful for all of you joining us and listening with us this afternoon. Welcome to Radio Waves of Change. I had to put on just a little bit of the radio voice to get you all introduced to all of these fabulous people on here. But I'll give a little bit of the intention behind this conversation first, and then I'll let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves. So by now, I think we all can agree that the artistic landscape is changing in a way that calls for much more authenticity and expression. And this means that there must be spaces where those authentic artists and presenters can thrive. Now, I'm sure you'll all be engaged in thought and conversation throughout this time at the conference, and I'm sure you already have, about how to change these institutions. But as we think about those legacy organizations, who are the amplifiers, if you will, of the issues that we are actively seeking to change? And how do we start there, making spaces and pipelines for artists to not only thrive, but where they belong? In this panel, I not only want to address the challenges of radio as an institution, but also the way that it is also the right avenue for change in this particular art form. And so I am joined on stage by some really talented and thoughtful folks in their respective fields. And honestly, that's really putting it lightly. And I'll allow them to introduce themselves. Beginning with Miss C. Sharpe.
Wow. All right, pew, 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 pew. Hi, I am Cecelia Sharpe from 90.9 WRCJ from right here in Detroit. Yes, woohoo, hometown, right? And I am a radio host. Music education is my background. Taught for many years in school as well as music advocation for music and music programming with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. So this is definitely my sandbox. Been doing radio for about 10 years now, and eased into television over the past 2 years with Detroit Public Television. And I'm so grateful to be here on this panel with these wonderful, dynamic people. So thank you, and thank you guys for coming.
I'm next. I'm James Muhammed. I'm president of Classical California, KUSC Los Angeles, KDFC San Francisco. We're the largest classical music radio network in the United States, ranking number 16 among radio streaming providers out there. I'm based in Los Angeles. I've spent a career in public radio and also public television, so this has been my space for quite some time. I know I look 28, but yeah, so I've been a classical music announcer, reporter, producer, worked in television and all those things now, but very happy to be working exclusively in the classical music space.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lydia Bangura. I'm really honored to be here on this panel today. A little bit about my background. I'm an operatic soprano, so I have both a bachelor's and master's degree in vocal performance. I'm still an active performer. And I also, during the pandemic, got really interested in kind of the academic side of music, music theory, music history. And so I decided I'm going to go back to school and get my PhD. So I live here in Michigan. I'm getting my PhD in music theory at the University of Michigan. I do music research, and I'm also teaching undergraduate courses there in music theory. And the reason why I'm on this panel, I'm still shook that I made it on here somehow. You should have seen my face when LaRob emailed me and asked, hey, would you be willing to come to the Sphinx conference and speak on a panel about radio? And I was like, radio? I have nothing to do with public radio. I'm actually a podcaster. So I host a podcast called Her Music Academia. I'm the founder and the host, and it's been going for almost 3 years. The podcast is a series of music interviews. So I interview everybody from performers to conductors, composers, music educators, other music scholars, music researchers about what they do in music with a pretty heavy classical music focus. I'm really excited to be included, even though it's not quite the same as radio, but in terms of audio mediums that are centering conversations around classical music, I'm really honored to be included.
Absolutely. And it's that precise reason that you are on this panel, so thank you for joining. And hello, everyone. In case I didn't introduce myself fully, I'm LaRob K. Rafael. I am a producer and host on Classical WFMT in Chicago, weekend morning host and co-host of Sounds Classical on Friday nights at 8. I'm also an arts advocate, a director, a founder, an artistic director, et cetera, et cetera. But today we're here to talk about radio and its ability or inability to change the landscape of classical music. So we'll just kind of jump right in with some of the conversations that we've been having. And we've talked a little bit about this discussion about preparing for today. And one of the things Cecelia and I joked about was this idea of presentation on radio that becomes very repetitive. And if you are in that field, you know that radio consists of basically this format: front announce, music. Back announce the music, you might have an ad, then you front announce, then there's music, and then so on and so forth and so on and so forth. And I wanted to kind of just present that as an example because in many ways, classical radio has been the same since Guglielmo Marconi patented in 1896, and certainly since the first radio broadcast of a symphony in in the 1920s at some time. So I wanted to pitch this question to all of you. In 30 seconds or more, maybe let's cap it at 1 minute, we're radio hosts, we can talk. Can you explain why you think radio might be too late to the game when it comes to expanding classical music presentation? Mm-hmm.
Are we starting with me?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So, I would say late. I don't think too late. But, when you think about, the origins of classical music programming, particularly like the public radio space, there was a distinct format, a distinct sound, and a distinct audience, a target audience for that. And so you had many people in the audience that were listening who were like my father, who were, well educated in music on the conservative side, an academic. And so the presentations weren't really designed for general audience, general consumption. It wasn't really even programmed for enjoyable experience broadly in general. And I think that what we have on my network is the direction that we're trying to go in many other stations to make it accessible, to have different voices who are presenting the music, that it's not trying to mimic the conservatory education of it, but really giving you enough context to appreciate what you're hearing to create an experience that is enjoyable, relaxing, and inspiring.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. I agree. I don't think it's too late, but definitely late in the game of presentation. And agreeing with what you said on how classical music has been geared, it has this era of exclusivity and for a particular audience. And if you don't fit that mold, then you're not welcome. But I think that people have, it's time to understand that the dynamics have changed. So many people have been introduced to classical music, quote unquote, classical music, and are enjoying it. And it's definitely the responsibility of the radio station to make sure that you're reaching that diverse audience through what you're presenting on the radio and tapping into what they want to hear and engaging with them in meaningful ways. And I'm pretty sure we're going to get to this later, but that also will eventually help to build that donor base as well. But also just breaking down those barriers of what classical music means and making it something that you can relate to. Just because it happened hundreds of years ago doesn't mean the same thing isn't happening today. It doesn't mean that the conversation isn't relevant and applicable. So I think breaking those barriers down, making things applicable, relevant to today, and just connecting with your people and recognizing who your listener and your audience really is.
Yeah, to echo what was said, I've learned so much from these folks about radio, again, as somebody who's kind of radio adjacent, but not quite the same thing. And when I think about, the push to try and include more composers of color or more women composers on the radio, I had kind of assumed as radio hosts, like, oh, the impetus for perhaps keeping things kind of the same and for, continuing this kind of standard format in terms of radio, that's coming top down, right? So like, oh, somebody is telling you this is the way that this station has always operated, this is how it has to go. But then I also, James made a great point about audience. I kind of had never, thought about before talking to the people on this panel that like it is actually the audience that is also really driving what is played on the radio. So, in terms of audience, think about the people that are coming to public radio to consume classical music. They're probably people who have been, invested in those stations for years, for decades, right? They expect the same thing. They, get invested in the personas that are behind the scenes in terms of radio. And so, newer hosts trying to come in and say, I really want to introduce Florence Price. I want to introduce Margaret Bonds. I want to write I want to be really intentional about championing, some different composers that we don't hear as often. I can imagine that there's some backlash from the audience, which
Absolutely.
is something that I don't really have experience with. Because as a podcaster, when you start podcasting and you put your first episode out there, you don't have an audience, right? You just put it out and you try to make the best quality product that you can, and you advertise so that the people that are meant to find it.
Yeah.
So if I say from the beginning, from the jump, this is what this podcast is about, I want to have conversations with musicians about what it means to have a career in the arts. I want to make sure that I'm platforming Black musicians, women of color musicians, women composers, conductors, performers, like from the jump, that that's what you're getting. And so I attract the exact audience that wants to consume that content versus with the radio, you're coming into an established narrative, and it's a lot harder to kind of subvert that narrative.
Yeah.
One more thing that you mentioned was the voice that people are used to hearing.
Right.
And I think that's another very important factor to what we're speaking to, because even if it's not the music and people may be open to change for the music, sometimes it's definitely difficult to change the minds of the voice that you're hearing and the way that the content is delivered and presented. And that can definitely, that barrier for sure is one that has been a little challenging to break down, but having to change that perception of what the sound of classical music is definitely another huge factor, the voice that you hear and that you come to know and love and expect.
Yeah, Lydia, you kind of touched on my next question, which was actually maybe directed specifically to you. Can you talk about some of the things that you think classical radio in particular could learn from streaming and podcasting as a format?
Right. Well, it's really interesting because, again, like I was saying, in terms of the difference of audiences, how do you cultivate an audience that actually wants to consume diverse voices talking about classical music and wanting to hear different music than the same kind of Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms? And, I think one thing about streaming and the audiences, the difference in audiences in terms of who's listening to the radio, are a lot of people of color listening to classical music radio? Are a lot of young people listening to classical music radio. Oftentimes younger folks are kind of going towards streaming on Spotify, Pandora. There are so many platforms in which you can kind of get your music instantaneously, and those platforms are really shaping taste, right? Really shaping expectations of what people are consuming. So one thing that's really coming to mind is the accessibility of podcasts, of streaming, of those platforms where, again, you get to experience it instantaneously, and they're really kind of shaping, tools like Spotify, which have like such advanced technology in terms of like predicting what you want to listen to and kind of almost shaping your taste for you as you're consuming, I think are really interesting. And I just want to think more about like, what is the accessibility of radio? Again, like who is it getting to? Who is it advertising for? Who's the ideal audience? And do they want classical music to change? Or are they coming to radio because they are planning on it being kind of an old-fashioned format or way of engaging with classical music?
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. I think accessibility is probably the main topic of discussion when we talk about changing format and advancing radio into the future. Stepping back just a little bit, I think James and Cecelia, you both sort of mentioned this idea of legacy with radio, and something that comes to mind often for me is the risk of compromising that legacy. Similarly to other matters of equity in our field, there's this hesitation for true change because people are afraid to compromise the integrity or the quality of their institutions. And I can speak for WFMT, which is a 70-year-old, station that has been doing the same thing over and over and over again. So radio is no different. At its worst, radio can be this sort of self-rejuvenating system that constantly allows the regurgitation of the status quo. Are people, as you mentioned, Lydia, are people seeking the change that radio can present? What do you think, Cecelia?
I definitely think people are seeking the change that radio can present. Just personally, with the hats that I've been grateful to wear as an educator, as an administrator, and just connecting with youth and people in the community. When I mentioned 90.9 WRCJ, I was surprised, but not surprised. But people felt comfortable to say, "Hey, I listened to your station," and it was so different than what I think the traditional look of what people who look like listen to classical radio. My students were coming, "Oh yeah, Ms. Sharpe, I listen on my way to school. My mom and I listen to that on the way to school." Their parents, that even though it's flipping to jazz, they're, "Oh yeah, I listen to classical and then I switched to jazz. I was at Whole Foods." And they're like, "Oh, I love the station." And I realized at that moment that the audience was broader than what we were catering to, and they were definitely receptive to broader content. And I feel as my role as a radio host, as a producer, I had the ability to be able to ask and serve the listener what they wanted to hear. So the change is people are ready for the change, but once again, going back, the station has to be open and ready to intentionally make that change to serve your whole audience and not just a percentage of it.
Yeah. I want to pose this next question to James, specifically because of that, Cecelia. How do we create the space for exploration in radio? I mean, as the president of the largest, radio system in the States, how do we create that space both for the presenter and the listeners?
Yeah, so, the entire approach is quite nuanced. So, I'm at an operation that dates back to 1946 and has a long history as a more traditional classical music station and many things that we do. And so from what we know from our research, from researching people with an affinity for classical music and even our donors, their taste is much broader than we assume it to be. And even we assume that donors are more conservative, and our research indicates that they enjoy what we're doing, and one of the things that they actually think that we're doing much better at and that they value is the diversity in the music. But it's also more than that. So especially when you're talking about reaching into different communities and reaching different audiences, what I have brought to our organization is paying close attention to public sentiment. How do people feel about us? And when we are, imagine, you're offered something by someone that you don't know, doesn't seem too friendly, and you're skeptical of. And we're offering classical music, and I think, it's important for us that we demonstrate that we actually, number one, have a passion for the music, that we're forward thinking about it, that we see it as a living organism, that we are engaged in the ecosystem of classical music and contributing to that. That's why the president of the operation is here. I didn't send anyone here. I'm here because I realize the importance of our institution and the relevance that we have and the power that we have, and how do we support the next wave of performers and composers and publishers. All of these people, we have a tremendous amount of resources that we can bring to bear. And we know that our audience members who support us want us to be doing this stuff because we've done research on it. And so we're actually doing those things. And so, when you're talking about it, a lot of times we think, if we play more Margaret Bonds, if we play more Steele, if we put a person of color on air. But the real thing is, what are you doing to demonstrate that you actually believe what you say? Because, there were people when I joined the organization who didn't understand the importance of my presence in certain spaces, and I'm not on the program. I'm just there. I show up to support and listen to, whether it's the Inner City Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles or whatever, that I'm there, and they're now one of our partners. And that shows a level of seriousness and provides genuine context for people to experience, whether it's our engagement efforts in the community, what we're doing on the air, and the taking us seriously when we are presenting music from diverse performers. And one of the things that we know in our latest research of our donors that was specifically mentioned, that they appreciate the diversity that they are experiencing and the learning opportunities that they are experiencing through how we are presenting classical music to them and allowing them to grow. So there's that level of authenticity that is absolutely important. But we always hear this, and we say always it starts at the top, but we have to define what that means. And I think there's a greater role for leaders in the space, particularly in radio, to be present, to come out. And the person in charge needs to show up and be involved. Otherwise, I can't expect you to take anything we say or do as seriously as I want you to.
There's that air horn.
Thank you so much, James. You touched on, I think, something that I wanted to talk about, and moving a little bit ahead of where we, planned. But it's a really important thing, and I think you talked about this, the role of the announcer, really, the role of the person who's presenting the music and their ideas as well. And I think that's something that I'm really passionate about, because I'm very new to this space. I'll be honest. I was thrown behind a microphone a few years ago and have happened to sort of found my footing. But I think the amazing thing about that is that I came to classical music with my perception of what it was and how it was changing. And that's what I present on the air. So I think a question that I am constantly asking as well when I'm presenting this music is, what even is classical music? What are we listening to right now? And as we start to see artists and what they're presenting changing, how are we encouraging the audiences that, like you said, Lydia, we've sort of inherited through radio? How are we encouraging them to ask those same questions? So I sort of wanted to pose that to you all, and Lydia in particular, as you're doing so much research about how the field is changing and the inclusion of artists of color, how do we present that to an audience on the air, in your opinion? That's a big question.
It's a really big question, and the role, like you're saying, the role of the announcer is so important. You are bringing your perspective, your experiences of classical music, on the radio for people to participate in. And so, like, the folks that are coming to the radio to consume that music and to engage, right? They have a specific idea of, well, my classical music is this, right? And I want to hear these performers, these orchestras, I want to hear these composers, and that's my perception of classical music. But we know, as folks that are in the classical music space, that are actively performing, actively teaching, right? Actively in conversation with arts administration, actively, right? Like, as folks that are present for what is happening, in organizations like Sphinx, in all of the endeavors that I'm sure you all are engaging with, we know that the world of classical music is incredibly diverse, and it always has been, right? We're not even presenting anything new. We're presenting a history that has been repressed, right? Intentionally suppressed. And so for folks that, again, aren't really ready to reckon with what has been hidden from music history, if they're not ready for it, I don't know what to tell you, but but we are presenting the classical music that we know is real and is happening and is exciting and vibrant and continuing an amazingly diverse legacy. So for folks that aren't ready to, again, engage with what classical music is actually doing today, and they want to hear the old hits or whatever that means, we are trying to intentionally bring in, that's why the role of the announcer is so important, because if I was someone who was really kind of convinced that classical music had a heyday and I'm only going to play the hits from a certain period of time, then that's what you're going to get, and you're going to experience my version of classical music. But our version, the one that we're trying to share, is one where we're not even presenting ourselves, I would say, as an authority on classical music, only here's the music that I'm really excited about, that I'm participating in, that my colleagues are participating in, and I want to share it with you. So not even kind of sitting up, on my podcast, like, and I'm the authority on all things classical music. That's not right. I don't necessarily posit myself as the expert or anything like that, right? But coming from a place of genuine connection, like let's share, let's have an exchange. That's another thing that maybe radio could think about in terms of Cecelia was saying, in terms of the response, the back and forth. What does the audience want to hear? Who do they know that's actively performing or recording, and how can we engage with what the actual real life connections that they have. For my podcast, we have a podcast email. Anybody can email in about the show with their comments or their questions or suggestions for what I should talk about on the show. Like, hey, have you heard of this new artist or this composer, or this piece just got published? So I get to consume so much new music just from what the listeners send in to me. And we've certainly had multiple times where a listener has written in and said, I really love what you do. Have you heard of this? And I'm like, no, I haven't. Thank you so much for suggesting that. And then it comes on the show. Or, thank you so much for doing the show. I work at so-and-so university or so-and-so, organization, and I'm like, oh, you should tell me more about that. Do you want to come on the show? It's actually really easy to get on the show, so send me an email if you want to come on. because I want to hear about what my community is doing now in music.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. I'm going to say this, and then I'm going to toss it over to Cecelia, who I know is just ready. But there is an idea, and I have to state this, and maybe in contrast to what you just said, there is an idea that radio is an institution that is the authority on what classical music is. So I want to state that, and then say that it is the job of institutions to have non-homogeneous announcers, to have people who have a diversity of thought, who can present the question, what is happening in the community, and to be programming accordingly, programming according to what is reflective of the area that you're in, what questions people are submitting, and what we're actually seeing in the field. Cecelia, I wanted to talk with you just a little bit about some of the opportunities that you do specifically in your work that are outside of presentation behind a microphone, but just some of the work that you do that helps bridge the gap between the person who's sitting behind the mic and the audience who's listening.
Yeah, I definitely think I took all these notes to respond to your question. Now
Please.
you're asking.
No. Respond as you see fit.
So just going back to carrying on to what Lydia was saying to your first question, I think one of the things, being that I was the first African American female on the classical side of 90.9 WRCJ, it was definitely, thank you. It was definitely, it was definitely an uphill battle at first, and not on the side of the radio station. They supported me, but the listener was not ready.
Yeah.
Wow.
Okay, I could mention the Tigers, and they're like, "Don't talk about the Tigers." I'm like, "It's your home team. Go get them Tigers." You know, we had the midday entree. If anybody's familiar with Chris Felsen, well, if I was filling in and I talked about, "Don't talk about food. We're not ready," and so it was hard. I was told, you don't sound this enough, you sound too much of this. And eventually I had to, because I love radio, I had to put all that aside. And it was more like fuel to the fire of to be committed to who I am and what I believe in as a radio host and a musician and an advocate, and knowing that everyone deserves access to this music. And so I think beginning to be yourself, but to show why you can change the hearts and minds of the listeners, but you have to be out in the community. So when you have events, you have to go out. And when someone would say, "Well, we don't really like you saying C sharp," that's my name. My name, and my mama named me Cecelia Sharpe, C sharp. So we like to hear you say you, but just showing like I respect what you're saying, but I can't allow you to put me in a box. So we have to have this exchange first. Like, we're gonna have this dialogue. Yes, my name is Cecelia. Respect that I go by C sharp. It's still my name, and even if it wasn't, that's what we're doing, okay? And I'm not changing the quality of what I'm presenting to you. So I think another thing is that saying, okay, so you're used to hearing this Brahms piece and you've heard it by this orchestra a million times. Well, let's present a different orchestra. Let's say if SSO, Sphinx Symphony Orchestra, did something, I'm gonna hear they did the same thing and it's still the same quality. So can you fuss about that? Did I just introduce you to something new? Did it taste good? Chew on that broccoli, it wasn't bad. So, okay. So like these spoonfuls of like food, making it relevant. Oh, you know what? He had mental health issues as well. And I know he was an amazing composer, but these are the challenges that he faced as a man. So you're bringing the humanity to the music and saying, okay, and guess what? We're still dealing with mental health awareness right now. And if he dealt with it and he did all of this, you can do it too. So you bring in that connectivity, that connection to things that people want to hear. You're building the trust of the audience. You're saying, I'm not diminishing the quality of what you're going to hear, but I will deliver something different than what you're used to hearing. And so I think, but you have to be out there. You have to be talking to the people, and you have to engage. I do a lot of social media when I'm on the air. I'm doing giveaways. I partner with people in the community. Is there anything? I will buy stuff out of my pocket just to give away, to say like, all right, okay, so we're going to Treat Dreams. All right, who wants ice cream for Treat Dreams? We're giving away. And so now I'm connecting you, the listener, with something in your community. So we're building. We're going beyond the music. We're building, we're engaging, we're connecting. And so you're just constantly working to find angles. Is there a young person that I can bring in that's interested in radio just to come on? Am I bringing little kids and toddlers into the station, which I do, and let them push the buttons and say WRCJ to the best of their ability? Did they record an ID? So many ways. What are you doing? You have to be out there. I'm asking them. In December, I did the listener's choice. And it was quite a challenge because I can program a show without any help. But I wanted to hear what the listener wanted to hear. Like, what do you want to hear on this show? Because I'm grateful that you're listening. But what is it that you want to hear? You tune in on Sundays. and they sent me their request. I want to hear this, and and then like Lydia said, then it's opening up something new to me. So we're having an exchange, and you're part of the show now. So we went from don't say this on the radio to now like, oh man, can I hear that too? Oh, we're having a dialogue. I played Marian Anderson on the radio, and they said it brought back a memory. This is when my mother took me, or when my mother taught me about this. And so we're breaking down those barriers. I'm having conversations. I bring on guests, to talk about mental health awareness, to talk about men's health, to have Ken Tompkins on, who was the first African-American trombonist in the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. He's on the show. You have Joshua McClendon, who is a cellist who's now at Juilliard, graduated, but is from right here in Detroit. So you can see where the talent is coming from. You can have meaningful conversations that connect people. And so you have to work to engage on, I think, every level possible. And I think another thing that we can do is meeting people where they are. So maybe you can't come to the swankiest event and you don't have $200 to give. Well, why not? Let's do a park party. Barbecue and classical music, or hot dogs and classical music, and you lower the price so that people can still come and connect with you in those ways. And then maybe they still want to give when it's time to give, because we're public radio stations, and so it's meaningful. It's definitely meaningful to them. Collectively, I know what the station has done. We've partnered with Detroit Public Television, who is our parent organization. And we've been doing, if you guys tune in to Channel 56, DPTV, we do One Detroit Weekend episodes. And who are the faces of saying where you should go for the weekend? Well, it's me, Dave, and Peter. And we're trusted authorities, going back to that authority. And so now you're seeing us on television. This is how you can engage, and this is what's going on in your community. So I think seeking as many ways as possible, individually and collectively, to engage with your audience. And if there are barriers, working to change the hearts and minds of the listener, and assure them that you're not changing the quality, diminishing the quality, but only providing even a broader smorgasbord of classical music for them to enjoy and learn about, and making it relevant.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Pew, 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 pew.
We're kind of coming up on time, but I do have a few more questions. James, I wanted to ask you, as the president of USC Radio Group in California, can you talk a little bit about the intentional change that you're seeing in the field?
And radio?
Yeah, in terms of radio, in terms of presentations, particularly of Black and brown artists,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of stations doing a really good job of adding diverse composers to their playlist and presenters. One additional step that we've done is we've actually coded our entire music library so that we can actually track to make sure that that our playlists are regularly diverse and paying close attention to prime time hours, that we're not pushing that into areas when you're not listening. And so that's been one of the things that we have found over time, that the majority of our donors and listeners actually appreciate. But one of the things you're talking about is I keep hearing like listener comments and donor comments, and there are people who don't immediately go along with these changes. And prior to arriving where I am, they had begun some work in this area, but probably didn't do enough as far as bringing people along with it. And so I have a lot of conversations with donors, and many of the people who are the most upset are pretty old. I mean, they could be 80, and there's some a generational gap in understanding what's happening. And I think there was assumptions made that people would just get it. And so in having these conversations with donors and foundations, first thing they want to know is that, number one, that you have a genuine commitment to classical music. All of these people want to see it continue. And when we're able to talk about what our work is doing to ensure the future of classical music, and looking at our playlist, that we could play Murray Pariah on a sonata, or there could be an up and coming pianists that we can also include one who's of Thornton School of Music, very good pianist, Steinway artist, Ricky Huang. We may put him in, but there's a mixture of those greats that but exposing you to what the future is and can be, and that's also supporting these performers and creating events. We had to do Kids Discovery Days, so we were just in East LA in the summer, and we had about 2,000 children and family members with a classical music presentation where we partnered with members of the community. People were walking to come to our event. And those are the kinds of things that it takes to really bring about change. And again, right, my dad used to call it the security giving operations. For a certain generation, they want to feel secure that you are not abandoning your commitment to classical music. And for many of them, how you communicate that, you have to meet them where they are. I have to meet them for coffee. I have to call them. I have to write. I have to have that conversation so they can grill me. And so, one of our strongest supporters, as a foundation in Southern California, I actually went to a board meeting, and the heir of the founder of the foundation just let me have it for about 45 minutes. And but it gave me an opportunity to explain why you're hearing what you're hearing. And because this person has a strong commitment to the future of classical music, didn't walk away 100% convinced that what we're doing was right, but she walked away 100% convinced that what we were doing was going in the right direction of what she wanted to see as far as classical music being appreciated and accessible moving into the future. So that's a level of work that actually has to happen on the micro and the macro level. And again, those people who are joining the fold, who are becoming more acquainted with classical music, and many of our donors self-identify as knowing a little bit about classical music. So we're creating the experiences, partnering with the organizations, connecting them, and also working with performers and institutions. We work very closely with the Inner City Youth Orchestra of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Children's Chorus. I mean, you name it, I'm out a lot. So, and I think that it's that level of attention to detail as sentiment is involved, that we are showing our audience members and the public and the community the level of respect that we say we believe in, and that we do truly have a commitment to classical music, but we are clearly taking a position on it that is future focused, maybe bold. Just an example, we have an announcer at our station named Jennifer Miller Hamill, phenomenal. She's on in the mornings in LA, and she had this idea for a long time prior to my arrival of doing more in the gaming space, composers in that space. So me being a risk taker or what, we actually we have a stream called Arcade that mixes traditional classical music that's used in the gaming space, and also these composers like Inan Zur, Christopher Ten, just amazing composers that are out there. And we start all our projects with looking very closely to the artistic value that they bring. And so these, just in this one space, creates a lot of opportunity for the future of classical music, and then exposing new audiences to traditional classical music, and and then just demonstrating that it's not as boring and stiff as you may think it is or heard it was. We try to be cool.
Thanks, James. We are at Q&A time, so I do want you, those of you who may have a question that you want to pose to us, to head to the app and put that question in the app, or you can stand at the microphone. I'd be happy to offer answers to those questions. And before we do that, I just want to say, I think the importance of this conversation is that you're talking to, or hearing from people who are kind of the voices on at these institutions championing for, as you mentioned, James, the future of classical music. And we are leveraging the influence of these institutions to advance what we see as the change in the field. And so we're working with independent artists. We're talking to those composers of color. We're talking to those performers of color. We're bringing them into the studio to record their work and to perform their work live so that the audiences who have for so long been used to hearing the Haydn and the Mozart and the Beethoven and the Brahms and the Bach and the get used to hearing what is actually happening today in our field. And I'm really, really proud to know each of you and the spaces and the work that you do to advance that and encourage people to be curious and take risks when it comes to classical music and presenting that in the media space. So thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you, LaRob.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Best moderator.
Do we have any questions? Hello.
Good afternoon. My name is Patrick Nugent. I'm president and CEO of the Dayton Performing Arts Alliance in Dayton, Ohio. We're the Dayton Opera, Ballet, and Philharmonic all wrapped up in one organization. It's nice to see my former colleague from Lyric Opera of Chicago.
Hey, Patrick.
I began my career in public radio, and I love radio, and I love hearing about the kinds of things that you all are able to accomplish in the medium. In our organization, there are a lot of artistic choices we can make about increasing representation and so forth. But the one place where I'm having a hard time figuring out how to tell the story is the story of the person of color who is a longtime lover of classical music or ballet or opera. And those are really powerful stories, so we're working on how to get them out there. We have a 24-hour classical radio station in Dayton, Ohio, Discover Classical, WDPR. It's wonderful. But I'm learning that African-American classical music fans in Dayton don't listen to it. They listen to WGUC in Cincinnati. And the reason is that a decade ago, WGUC started putting on a membership promo. And it's a story that it's an African-American woman moving to Cincinnati. She talks about driving over the ridge on Interstate 75 where you suddenly get a gorgeous view of the beautiful skyline of Cincinnati. It's downtown, it's at night. She'd figured out the WGUC was the station. She was listening to it. And as she comes over that ridge and is having all this anxiety about a new city, she hears a setting of the 23rd Psalm, and it just transformed her whole attitude about moving to this new community. Well, black listeners listen to WGUC because 10 years later, they're still telling that story. So my question is, are there things that you all are doing to help lift up the voices and share the stories of people of color who have been classical music listeners for long periods of time in a way that could say to others that, you know, this art really is for everyone, this medium really is for everyone? Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Anyone?
Yeah,
I've got thoughts, but I'll pass it. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say thank you for that question. You know, I am someone who is deeply steeped in the classical music world. I started as a violist around age 9 and have, you know, been involved with classical music ever since and got into opera when I was in university. And so as someone who has like grown up playing in orchestra, has always been, you know, the only black person in the orchestra, stories like that are deeply meaningful to me because they're relatable to me. And so, you know, the conversations that I wanted to see happening in classical music as I was getting into my PhD and getting into the music academic world, I was like, I'm not seeing these conversations. And what do Black people do when we don't see it? We make it happen, right? We create our own spaces, we create our own platforms, and that's why I started this podcast. So I can speak from my own perspective in terms of if those are the stories that are really relatable to me as somebody who has a similar background, how can I get other musicians on the show, other Black musicians, to talk about that experience? What is it like, you know, to be the only Black person in the orchestra? Or what is it like, you know, with your background, being the only musician in your family, right? Starting a musical legacy for your family. And so that is a huge, huge goal of my podcast, is to tell those types of stories and to demonstrate that especially American classical music has always been Black, right? There have always been African Americans involved in the creation and the performing of that music. Absolutely. And so as much as I obviously enjoy other Black genres like R&B and rap and hip hop and jazz and blues and right, like we're so foundational to all of American music, right? But with every genre. But in terms of my own experiences being so deeply steeped in classical music, I want to tell that narrative because I didn't have that narrative when I was growing up. I'm originally from Phoenix, and again, very, grew up in pretty white spaces. And so it wasn't until I was in grad school when I first heard the music of Florence Price, right? When I first knew that there were Black folks in classical music. So how can we subvert that narrative before people are in their 20s in grad school, right? Like how can we bolster that narrative that we've always been doing it and we're always going to be doing it?
Yeah, I think just to piggyback off of that, there's also, and we talked a little bit about this, the role of the announcer is very important. It sounds like, and you please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like there's just been an ad that's been running for 10 years. What would it look like to actually have a Black announcer in that space? Okay, so yeah, I mean, you have somebody who is there to actually narrate what it means to be Black and in that space, as Lydia is saying, and loves classical music. Yeah. It's not, impossible. It's not unheard of. Black people, as Lydia stated, we've been in this genre since it began, and so there is an idea, though, for a lot of Black and brown listeners, as with every other space in this particular field, classical music, that it has not been a safe space for us. And until we have presenters who look like and sound like and present like and can contextualize like us, it will continue to be a very, very distant space for us to be involved with. I am always so it really churns my heart sometimes when I go to a performance at CSO or Chicago Philharmonic and somebody comes up to me and they're like, oh my God, you're LaRob K, Rafael. I've been listening to classical music all my life and I never listened to WFMT, but I heard your voice and I said, that's a Black man. And I'm like, I'm glad you know. But that's so important for listeners to be able to connect with somebody. I mean, imagine what it must feel like to, be listening all your life to the music of Mozart and Mozart and Mozart, and it only be presented by somebody who is white. Yeah. You have no relation to their story, and so what does it look like to bring in presenters who actually have the background in Blackness and in classical musicness to present the music to audiences who look a little bit more diverse?
Sorry.
Great question.
I just wanted to throw in, I know a little bit about the market, and actually, I think my brother's on your board, William Caldwell. But yes, so just going back, I've been in public radio a minute, but WGUC has a long history of engaging the Black community in Cincinnati, going back to the work that their collaborations with Cincinnati Pops and the work that Eric Kunzel did with the Central State University Chorus recordings, and then the station regularly featuring the chorus. I know they were very intentional of featuring people like Mary Henderson Stuckey, who's actually was my dad's voice student 2,000 years ago, and things like that. So they have had a consistent engagement in this space over time. I listened to Dayton Public Radio for many years, and it was very different. I enjoyed it, but wasn't Cincinnati. And so my thoughts on that are really think about how you're presenting what you present and what is your level of engagement in the community. What's the sentiment? It seems like if you say what your institution is, it's ringing hollow in that community. And the question is, I always start with asking them, but I think I know. But what are the opportunities to be involved in every community? There's a group of diverse folks engaged in a classical music effort somewhere. They're all over Los Angeles. You can go to Tuscaloosa, Alabama. How can you be involved in that? How can you participate? How can you help? And how can you be consistent in that? And it has to start with the leader being present. Doesn't have to be there all the time, but the leader has to be there because, you have to have a clear understanding of how different communities process engagement. And for communities that have been marginalized and disenfranchised, they're sniffing you for authenticity.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And part of that is how consistently do you show up? Do you do what you say? And how, in what ways are you trying to help? Or are you just here because you're trying to get something? Are you serving all communities because it's the right thing to do?
Right.
Yeah.
Because so I indiscriminately offer KUSC to everybody download our app, Classical KUSC App Store. I indiscriminately offer our station to people because I can't prejudge who will enjoy it. Because I've offered it to a guy standing on the corner that you would think would have no interest in it. And they'll sample it for 2 weeks and say, you know what, I love it. It's what I listen to when I'm trying to relax or whatever. It could be functional, but it's how are you being present and how are you doing, how are you offering it? And I think too, it's also important if you can have diverse announcers, but I think it is also helpful if those announcers have roots in communities too. I guess it's safe to say it's not enough just to be black in color. I think people, you want people who have an interest in reaching diverse communities as well. And you can't assume because someone is of a particular ethnic group that they have that mission. You really shouldn't do that because there are people who don't. There are clearly people who, work in my position and they personally do not take that on because that's not who they am and they haven't adopted that as a mission for the organization. So I think those are things that will help. Once people understand that, hey, our mission is to serve, and we believe that if you love wonderful music, if you have a taste for excellence in music, I don't care if you're listening to hard rock right now, try us, because this is great music.
Thank you. Thank you, James. We're running out on time. I want to make sure we hit at least one more question, if there is one. Will there be another?
Hi, thanks for this. Thanks for being here, and thanks for letting me speak. My name is Levi Taylor. I am a Kennedy Center artist, composer. I'm writing an opera right now, a short opera for the Kennedy Center, the Washington National Opera. I'm also a film and television composer out in Los Angeles, just moved there.
Download my app.
Pardon?
I'm sorry.
Oh, yes. I will. I absolutely will. And actually, I hope I get a chance to speak with you as well. I'll be at USC on the 31st, actually. If there's a chance to connect, I would love that. So speaking to actually what you mentioned earlier, Lydia, like it's been in my mind this whole time about how my upbringing, right, through gospel, I'm right here in Detroit, Motown, gospel music, jazz. I mean, so embedded in this culture, blues. I mean, when I went to church every Sunday, it was like, we're singing the blues. It was so steeped in blues, but it was gospel, it was our tradition, it was like jazz. And that being who I am at my core, but what was interesting is that I was always also drawn to like Maurice Ravel, Darius Milhaud, Stravinsky, Barber, right? And so I expressed myself through all these things that I grew up in, but then the creative depth that classical music offers me, as well as jazz and all the other art forms, but in this particular for me, it's been interesting in my journey because when I went to LA, I have doing work, whatever, in LA, my agent immediately said, hey, can you make beats? And I'm like, yeah, I can make beats. But there's all this other stuff that I really love and who I am and what I do. And so my question is, as a composer with this intention, are there platforms in classical radio for me to present, especially so with the Kennedy Center, we're doing art for art's sake, but we're also doing art for social impact. So like Carlos Simons and Mark Bamuthi Joseph's, their recent album, Breath, that just came out, Right? I don't know if but it's incredibly impactful. And so the work that I do as a classical composer and a film composer, I like to write pieces that perhaps it's not concerto in A flat major. It's let me present this idea and this feeling, something that we can all sit together with and have a conversation about later on. It might not sound exactly like what we're used to in the classical world because it's coming from a different place. Is there room for that in classical radio? Does that make sense?
It absolutely makes sense. And I appreciate you for asking that question. We are out of time, but I want to say this. Absolutely, there is room for that in classical spaces. And I think talking to these people, and myself included, there is space for us to curate in that space as well. And there are so many other people for you to meet and talk to who can incorporate that. Again, it kind of just goes back to this idea of the role of the announcer. You have to find the people who have a vested interest in the transformation of this field. And those are the people who will highlight and promote this very important work and impactful work. If you listen to me on Saturdays or Sundays, I am always playing anything new by Carlos Simon. I'm playing anything new by Sean O'Pebolo, because this is the intentional work that we're doing that is advancing the field, that is dispelling what we think classical music sounds like. Again, my question is always, what even is this music that we're listening to? Jesse Montgomery and I always joke that it's like orchestral, experiential string music, something like that. But I think there's definitely space, and I'd be welcome to kind of talk more about that with you. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for your questions. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Now walk it out.